The roar of a sports car engine echoed through the busy streets of the city. Martin, 28 years old, was the rightful heir to the renowned real estate empire his father, Jonathan, had built. He drove his bright red sports car, his cold gaze behind designer sunglasses, completely ignoring the people who hurriedly stepped aside. The luxurious suit and shiny watch on his wrist exuded arrogance as he sped through intersections, disregarding the red lights. A proud thought crossed Martin's mind. The people in this area should be grateful for my presence. I don't understand why my father didn't turn these properties into a more upscale neighborhood. On the opposite sidewalk, Sadie, 22 years old, with rough hands from hard labor, was pushing an old recycling cart along the narrow sidewalk. Her eyes gleamed with determination, but the fatigue was evident as she carefully searched for each recyclable item. Her simple clothes and faded, torn hat were a stark contrast to Martin's flashy appearance. Sadie didn't notice the speeding sports car. Her mind was preoccupied with her sick grandmother. If I don't make enough money this week, how can I buy medicine for her? She's all I have left, she thought to herself, worried. Suddenly, the screech of tires on the pavement made Sadie startle and step back, her heart racing. Her recycling cart tipped over, its contents scattered all over the street. Martin slammed on the brakes, stopping just inches away from Sadie. Her terrified gaze met his cold, angry stare. Silence filled the air until Martin shouted, "What kind of walking is that? You almost scratched my car. Do you know how much this car is worth? More than what you could ever earn in your whole life." Jonathan, Martin's father, had just left a business meeting in the nearby building. He decided to walk home and happened to witness his son arguing with a street cleaner from a distance. He hurried over, his heart heavy with shame and disappointment. "Oh my God, where did I go wrong? How could my son become so cruel? This is not the way I taught him," he thought. Blinded by anger, Martin got out of the car and slammed the door shut. His face was red, veins popping on his forehead as he stormed towards Sadie in a threatening manner. The young woman was still trembling, trying to pick up the scattered items from the street, but stopped when she saw the fury in Martin's eyes. "You almost dirtied my car with your ragged clothes in this mess. I should sue you for emotional and material damages. People like you deserve to be swept off the streets of this city. I'll meet with the mayor and make sure all the filthy beggars like you are cleaned out of here." Yeah. and Jonathan, witnessing the increasingly tense scene, felt his blood boil. He quickly stepped forward, his muscular frame overshadowing both Martin and Sadie. His usually calm face was now twisted in embarrassment and disgust. He grabbed Martin's arm, forcing him to face him. Jonathan's eyes, usually gentle, were now ablaze with anger, making Martin step back. "Enough, Martin. How dare you treat a person like this? Have you completely lost your mind?" Jonathan's voice thundered, drawing the attention of passers-by. Martin, momentarily stunned by his father's sudden appearance, quickly regained his arrogant posture. He yanked his arm away from Jonathan's grip and straightened his expensive suit as though it had just been dirtied. His eyes flashed with anger and defiance. "You don't understand. This woman almost ruined my car. She has no right to be here, hindering people like us. Why are you protecting someone like her?" Jonathan felt a wave of disgust wash over him as he listened to his son's words. He turned to look at Sadie, still standing there, shocked and trembling amidst the broken belongings. Turning back to Martin, Jonathan could hardly believe what he had just heard from his son. "A person like you? Do you think your actions are those of a respectable person? Look at yourself, Martin. See what you have become." He turned to Sadie and asked gently, "What's your name, young lady?" Sadie, still in shock, replied in a trembling voice, My name is Sadie Allen, sir." Jonathan turned to Martin, his voice rising, full of sternness. "You must apologize to this young lady immediately, Martin." Though he didn't want to, Martin felt the pressure of his father's sharp gaze and furrowed brow. Reluctantly, he turned to Sadie, and the apology came out awkwardly. I'm sorry." Jonathan looked at Sadie with a soft tone. "I, Jonathan, apologize on behalf of my son's disrespectful actions. I will teach him how to respect others," he promised. Jonathan stared at Martin, his eyes burning with uncontrollable rage. He almost shouted at his son, "You have two choices, Martin. One is to marry this girl and learn the true value of humanity. The other is to forfeit your inheritance and lose everything." Martin stood frozen in disbelief. "Dad, you're joking, right? You're going to take away my inheritance just because—" Jonathan didn't let him finish, his voice low and full of authority. "This is no joke, Martin. If you can't treat others with respect, you don't deserve anything from this family. You will get not a penny if you continue to live like an insensitive and selfish person." A surge of anger welled up inside Martin, but immediately a thought crossed his mind. His grandmother, the one person he could always rely on, would help him get out of this situation. She had always spoiled him, and he knew she would never let Jonathan do anything to hurt him. Without saying another word, Martin turned and walked away, not looking back. He drove the sports car at high speed, indifferent to the gaze of his father or the girl left behind. Despite the tension in the air, he was confident that his grandmother would help him resolve everything, just as she had done countless times before. Meanwhile, Jonathan, feeling the weight of his failure as his son walked away, took out a wad of money and handed it to Sadie. "You don't deserve to endure my son's actions," he said, his voice softer now, feeling a sense of shame as he recalled the scene of Martin leaving. "Ma'am, your hostess has been murdered. You might want to speak to the elders." However, Sadie simply shook her head, her eyes full of resolve and without hesitation. "I don't need your money," she replied, her voice calm yet strong. "My worth is not measured by money. I just need respect." Jonathan was surprised, not expecting the girl to reject an offer most people would never turn down. He silently watched her walk away, a new sense of respect rising within him as his son once again left the family to chase after his illusions. When Jonathan entered the house, he saw Martin sitting on the chair, still fuming with anger, while his grandmother sat across from him, her expression stern. Jonathan immediately knew Martin had sought her help, but this time things were different. She stood up, her eyes blazing, and shouted, "You're a heartless, selfish person. All you think about is yourself, never once caring about others. You've disgraced this entire family." Martin was stunned, unable to speak. She continued, her words biting, You think I'll save you? No, you have to learn this lesson. No one is going to save you." Martin fell silent, feeling, for the first time in his life, that there was no one left to protect him. Jonathan looked Martin directly in the eye, his tone firm. "In 24 hours, you have two choices. Either marry the garbage collector, Sadie, or lose your inheritance forever. The choice is yours." Martin, enraged, yelled, his eyes red, before quickly storming off to his room and slamming the door shut. The next day, Martin went to Sadie's house. As he entered, he didn't greet her or apologize for his actions the previous day. He simply looked around the modest house, his eyes scanning the faded walls and old furniture. With a sneer, he said, "You live here, in a place like this? There's nothing here but cheap, worthless things." Sadie looked at Martin with a cold gaze, refusing to lower her head before his contempt. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice full of challenge. Martin looked at her, took a deep breath, and coldly replied, "Actually, I only have two choices. Either marry you or lose everything. But don't think I like you," Sadie continued. "That's none of my business. Do you think a selfish, useless person like you is someone I'd want? That's delusional." Martin felt as if a cold bucket of water had been thrown over him. But then, something clicked in his mind. His eyes drifted to the bed where Sadie's father lay, and a new plan formed in his mind. He smiled coldly, his voice chilling. "Is that so? You don't want to marry someone like me. But what if I could save your father's life? Would you still refuse?" Like I mean. Sadie stared at him, her expression shifting, then pulled Martin outside, as if not wanting anyone in the family to hear. Her eyes were filled with conflict and pain, but at that moment, she knew there was no other choice. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice choking. Martin didn't answer right away, only giving her a cold glance, then said seriously, "I want you." His words hit like a devastating blow, crushing all of her hopes. Sadie looked back at the room where her father lay, her eyes weary, filled with illness. She felt the painful years rushing back to her mind, the sacrifices made over the years. Oh man. Sadie clearly remembered when she was a little girl, dreaming of a bright future, a life without want, without struggling every day to survive. But poverty, hunger, and hardship had shattered all those dreams. She had to abandon her education and take on strenuous jobs, from trash collection to cleaning houses, all for one reason. Her father, the man she loved more than anything, had been sick for 5 years with no cure. She still remembered the sleepless nights, fearing that tomorrow could be his last day. Looking into Sadie's eyes, Martin felt no sympathy. All he saw was a poor girl with nothing of value. Sadie looked at him, her heart aching. She glanced at the bed where her father lay weakly. "Dad, I'm sorry," she whispered to herself. Now, Martin stood in front of her, offering an ultimatum she couldn't refuse. She felt cornered, with no way out. All the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the tears, hadn't been enough to save her father. She had to choose. "All right, I agree." Her voice was faint, but it was the only thing that could save her beloved father's life. She signed the paper, each stroke of the pen feeling like a dagger to her heart. All the hopes, all the dreams, everything she had once longed for were now replaced by a painful sacrifice. "Dad, I did it all for you. I had no other choice," she whispered in her heart, feeling as though everything had been stripped away from her. For the first time in her life, Sadie felt like she was no longer herself. The years of hardship had hardened her, but this pain still shattered her heart. However, to her, it was all worth it if it meant saving her father. A week later, Sadie saw a significant change in her life. Her father, who had been battling illness for 5 years, was now receiving treatment thanks to the money Martin had promised. He lay in the ICU, his health gradually stabilizing, and Sadie felt a part of the burden in her heart lift. Yet, the pain, the humiliation from the years of struggle, and the sacrifices she had endured could never be erased from her mind. She had learned to accept it, but she could never forget it. Then the wedding day arrived, a day she had never expected but was forced to face. Sadie had been preparing for this moment for a long time, but in her heart there was no joy. Martin stood waiting at the altar, his gaze cold, devoid of warmth or concern. She had no other choice but to walk down the aisle, not because she loved him, but because her family, especially her father, needed this help. The bride walked out of the church, and immediately, all eyes were on her. No one could believe that the girl who had just walked out was the bride of this wedding. Not even 22 years old, but Sadie's beauty left everyone in awe. Her delicate face, her eyes shining brightly under the stage lights, captivated everyone. A pure, natural beauty, without the need for heavy makeup or embellishment, radiated softness and innocence. Martin stood frozen, unable to believe his eyes. The girl he had once mocked and belittled now stood before him in a magnificent wedding dress, so beautiful it left him speechless. The garbage collector girl now seemed like a princess from a fairy tale. But behind her beauty lay a different story, one that only those who had witnessed her life could truly understand.
The boyfriend,
glowing from beyond the glim, was the lovely blue-eyed Martin had seen on the Goblin. By the sound of heavy footsteps on the grass outside the window, Charlie started to slow down. He looked at his watch. 9 a.m. Surely, the name on the door was absolutely wrong. One of those who had witnessed her life could hardly be wrong. Sadie was not the pampered girl from a wealthy family, nor was she someone who lived a life of ease like many others. She had endured years of hardship, working tirelessly from a young age. The heavy tasks, the long hours, everything was just so she could provide for her family, take care of her mother, her father, and especially care for her sick father. She had never had time for herself, never allowed herself to dream or think about a better future. For her, a day without struggling to survive was a day of happiness. Every day, she had to face the contemptuous stares from those around her, the mocking words, the arrogant looks. All of it seemed like part of the life she had to endure. She was the trash collector in the eyes of others, the image that society disregarded, a nameless figure in this busy world. But if fate hadn't placed her in this situation, if she had been born into a wealthy family, perhaps she would have been a refined young lady, loved and respected. She would have been cared for, protected, and given opportunities to grow. Instead, she had to do all these things, not because she chose to, but because she had to survive and protect her family. And now here she stood in the middle of the wedding hall, in her pristine white wedding dress, like a precious jewel. But deep down in her heart, there was no joy, only helplessness and pain, because she had never been able to control her destiny. She was just a girl forced into this marriage, with the sole hope of helping her father get treated and helping her family get through their hardship. The wedding went on as usual, nothing special, until an unexpected event occurred right in the middle of the ceremony. As everyone was mesmerized by the display of sweet wedding photos on the screen, a surprising scene appeared. Instead of happy pictures, a wedding agreement suddenly flashed on the screen, just like the contract between Martin and Sadie. The crowd in the hall was stunned, then fell silent, all eyes turning to the bride who had revealed this secret. Sadie, no longer silent, spoke in a calm yet cold voice, making everyone in the room jump in shock. "This is the reason I had to agree to marry him." Sadie spoke up, her eyes showing no fear or shame. "Just for this, just for the inheritance rights, he was willing to do anything for. No love, no care, just power and money." The entire wedding hall was stunned by this revelation. Martin, now pale, didn't dare to speak a word. All eyes were on him, filled with contempt and criticism. The bride not only shocked everyone with this truth, but also with the courage to expose it on her own wedding day. Martin couldn't argue back. He stood silently, his head lowered, not daring to meet the eyes of the people around him. The insults and the contemptuous glances from everyone felt like they were crushing him. He had let selfishness and greed control him to this point, and now he had to face all the shame and anger of everyone. The criticisms echoed, and at that moment the overwhelming shame almost caused Martin to collapse. At that moment, Jonathan, his father, stood up, his face stern and cold, without hesitation. "Martin, enough. You failed too much," Jonathan said, his voice cold but full of authority. "This is the price of selfishness. You won't inherit anything anymore. Stand up and live the life you deserve. Leave this house right now." After the disastrous wedding, Martin had nothing left. He lost everything. No house, no money, no job. Everything was forbidden by the family, from assets to vehicles. In his despair, with no way out, Martin decided to do something he had never considered before: go to Sadie's house, even though he knew it would subject him to her scolding and disdain. When he reached Sadie's doorstep, he hesitated for a moment, then suddenly decided to knock. Sadie opened the door, seeing Martin, her eyes cold but full of contempt. "What are you even here?" Sadie asked, her voice tense. Martin was silent for a moment, then looked up at her, speaking with determination. "You can yell at me as much as you want, but I have no other choice. You pushed me to the edge, and now I'll follow you." Sadie lifted her chin, unable to hide her anger. "Do you think I'll help you? What have you done with your life? Do you think I'll take in someone as useless as you?" Martin didn't give up. He spoke in a low but firm voice. "I know you don't need me, but I have nowhere else to go, and I'll stay here, no matter how much you yell at me or look down on me." From that moment on, Martin lived with Sadie's family, in a house he never imagined he'd have to live in. It was an old, dilapidated house with peeling walls and a damp wooden floor. The smell of mildew, grease, and leftover food filled the space, making Martin feel as though he was living in a real dump. After a week of living in such a poor, dreary and lacking environment, Martin began to feel like he couldn't just sit still any longer. Despite always showing disdain for garbage collection, he decided to go out with Sadie to work. He only followed her, offering no help. One evening, while they were working on a quiet, deserted street, Sadie was mocked and taunted by a group of young men. They ridiculed her job, shouted at her, and even used crude language. Martin stood still for a moment, but then the anger inside him flared up. He couldn't let the girl he had always looked down on endure such treatment. He rushed in and shoved one of the men, determined to protect Sadie. The group of boys didn't stop resisting, and a scuffle broke out. Martin, though not particularly strong, was driven by his frustration and desire to protect Sadie. After a brief moment of chaos, the group of young men fled, leaving Martin and Sadie standing in the middle of the street. When they returned home, Sadie's family looked at him with surprise and concern. They asked how he was, quickly helping him apply ointment to the scratches on his hands. At that moment, an unfamiliar warmth rose within Martin. No, I'm getting a waterfalls. I'm totally in the mood. Call me soon. Bingo. Definitely. He could feel the genuine care from her family, something he had never experienced on his own. This wasn't conditional concern or calculated affection, but real, sincere care. While Sadie applied medicine to his wounds, Martin sat silently, his heart suddenly heavy. He looked at her, the girl who had endured so much hardship. She had spent her youth taking care of her family, worrying about her sick father, yet she never complained. She was unlike the young ladies he had known, who were fortunate enough to live in luxury, but she had a strong and resilient heart. Martin felt sympathy for her, sensing the pain she had gone through. He thought about his life before, about the wealth and leisure he once had, and now, looking back, all those things seemed meaningless. He suddenly realized that Sadie, despite all the difficulties she had endured, was living a life that was much more meaningful than he had imagined. She was strong, and in some way, he felt that this girl was more precious than anyone else in his life. After 2 months of living with Sadie's family, Martin began to experience the strange peace of life that he had never known before. Although Sadie's family was poor, they always lived with love and took care of one another. Every meal, they gathered together, and even though they had little, they were all happy, ready to share the best they had, even if it was just a bowl of rice filled with love. What moved Martin the most was the kindness Sadie's family showed to those who were even worse off than themselves. They never hesitated to help others, even if they didn't have enough to live comfortably. Whenever someone needed help, whether big or small, Sadie's family was always ready to lend a hand. The people in the neighborhood respected and loved them because they understood the kindness this family brought. During his time living with them, Martin saw them work hard, doing strenuous jobs to make a living. Sadie, her mother, and her brother worked all day, from early morning until late at night, collecting trash, cleaning, and selling goods. Yet they always smiled, always tried to keep each other happy, despite the many challenges life threw at them. As the days passed, Martin began to change. He was no longer the arrogant young man who only knew how to live in self-satisfaction. He learned humility, how to share, and most importantly, he learned how to love and respect the people around him. He began to understand that a full life is not measured by wealth or material possessions, but by the warmth of family love, by the moments of living genuinely and sincerely with one another. Martin began to realize that it was Sadie's family, though poor, that lived more fully and happily than any wealthy family he had ever known. After 2 months of living with Sadie's family, Martin gradually began to understand the true value of love and family. He no longer saw her family as poor, but as a place filled with love and sacrifice. During the days spent collecting trash with her and the nights spent gathered together, he learned the profound meaning of loving and caring for each other. Martin began to understand that family is not just where you were born, but where you feel love and care. He left Sadie not because of her appearance or wealth, but because she taught him what compassion and resilience truly meant. Now, Martin was no longer a selfish man, but someone who knew how to love and cherish every moment with the person he loved. He was grateful to her, for she and her family had helped him realize the true value of life. After some time living with Sadie's family, Martin decided to return home and ask his father for permission to go back to work at the company. He had changed so much, no longer the selfish young man he once was, but now a mature man who knew how to love and appreciate life. Martin also asked his father for permission to marry Sadie, the one who had helped him discover the true meaning of family and love. When Martin returned, his father Jonathan could not hide his emotion. He looked at his son with pride in his eyes and said, "Martin, you've made me proud. No one can change the past, but you've learned to stand up and start over. You've found peace in your heart. And Sadie, that girl has saved you." Martin bowed his head and moved. He said, "I'm so grateful to her. If it weren't for Sadie, I might never have known what true happiness is." Finally, Martin asked Sadie to marry him, and their love story ended, not with a contract, but with sincere love, full of empathy and growth. After months of trials and suffering, they both found peace in each other's arms. Their wedding was no longer a bargain, but a celebration of true love. The ceremony took place in a warm, simple atmosphere, yet deeply meaningful. The young couple exchanged sincere vows, not out of duty or for fame and fortune, but because of love and mutual respect. The two families, coming from different backgrounds, were now joyful, having found a deep connection. Martin, once an arrogant young man, was now a mature man who knew how to appreciate what he had. Sadie, the humble girl, had changed his life, not just through sacrifice, but with her boundless love. "We will build a happy family together," Martin said, his eyes full of love as he looked at Sadie. "And we will always be grateful for everything we've gone through, because they were valuable lessons." Sadie smiled, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "As long as we're always together, we can overcome any difficulty." And from that moment, they lived happily ever after, building a family full of love, where there were no ulterior motives, only understanding and sharing. They had overcome everything to be together, and together they stepped into a future full of hope.